Hi there, and a very warm welcome to this week's long tip. After last week's deep dive into dispersion and aberration and the weeks before a modeling tutorial, there were a lot of requests for part 3, including the lighting of the diamonds. But since I don't want to go on forever with this series, I'm packing all of the rest together in this tutorial, meaning that we will be covering lighting, a little bit of rendering and output, and then the compositing stage. Because compositing is as important of a workflow as everything else. So since we have so much ground to cover, let's keep moving. Welcome to Chart Time, this time with a concept that is very dear to my heart and I like you to know because it's very important when lighting scenes, especially when lighting a lot reflective or refractive objects, as diamonds are. So, in this concept, I want to talk about the relation of the size of the light in regards to its reflection or refraction brightness. As you all know, we need a certain amount of photons in our scene to gain a certain lightness, so the camera can see anything. And since those photons are generated on the surface of our lights, if you have a smaller surface, more photons per surface area has to be generated to reach the same brightness as with a larger light. So with a smaller light, you concentrate a lot of photons within a very small space, which creates a very bright light source. And therefore the reflection and or refractions of that light source are also very bright. So let's move on with the chart here and let's show you what a bigger light source might look like. So the bigger light source has its energy spread over a larger area and therefore is a little bit more dim in the reflections. And if we go even further and make the light source even larger, the refractions and reflections get even weaker. This concept, of course, not only goes for diamonds, but for everything that reflects or refracts light. But since a diamond lives off of contrast between light and dark tones in your scene, this affects the sparkly factor of a diamond immediately. And this is why it's so important to understand this concept. Now, if you don't quite follow, don't be afraid, we have a hands-on chapter next. So here we go. Welcome to our hands-on approach. Let's explain the scene a little bit. So the scene is very simple. It's only lit by one light source and we have two spheres in it. One with a reflective glossy material with a black diffuse and an IOR of 1.5 and then just a diffuse sphere here. The light source is set to surface brightness ticked off. That means that the amount of photons is generated by the size of the light, meaning that a smaller light source generates more photons and a larger light source generates less photons. Now, Octane doesn't work with photons, but with brightness levels, but since in real world more photons means more brightness, this is sort of the same. So again, I want to show that the size of the light source very much impacts the way the scene is looking and the way the reflections are looking. So if I actually increase the size of the light here, you can see that the reflections actually weaken because the area in which the photons are generated gets larger and the same amount of photons are generated and therefore the overall brightness of the scene stays the same. So as you probably have guessed, if I turn the size of the light source smaller, the opposite happens, so the reflections become incredibly strong. Because now the small size of the light source has to generate all the photons to get the brightness into the scene. We can emphasize this a little more by changing to a close-up camera here. And this small bright speck here is our highlight. And we don't see it as a very bright highlight because our eyes are used to having sort of side effects from bright highlights, being, if I turn on the post effects, some blurry glow. What I mean by that is that if we are looking into bright light sources, we are so used to seeing glows and glints that this is so ingrained into our brain that we expect the same from any rendering we see. So if we have that now, this highlight looks a lot brighter than without the post effects. Because, as I said, our eyes are used to seeing glints from very bright highlights. Now, if I go to my light size again and increase that slightly, you can see that this glinting is going away because the light gets bigger and therefore not as strong in the reflection anymore. As I was searching for analogies for this behavior, I came across the idea of a water hose. So if you want to deliver 3 liters per second for your garden, for example, and you have a very big hose, the water has to flow through it very slowly to achieve the amount of 3 liters per second. While if you have only a straw, the water has to flow through it incredibly fast to reach the 3 liter per second mark. And basically that's the same with the light source and the brightness. So the fastness of the water translates to the brightness of the light, if that makes sense. Would be cool to have a video of that, but I don't want to expand that video beyond even the longest attention span of yours. So let's keep moving and actually come back to the scene. So what do I want to tell you with that? Basically, since a diamond is a reflection and a refraction in itself, the brightness of the light is incredibly important for its look. So you have to strike a balance between a large, weak reflecting light source and a small, strong reflecting light source. Because as you can imagine, a strong reflecting light source also creates a lot of sparkliness. So, and depending on your scene, you want to create more or less sparkly looking diamonds, and therefore you can change the light size and its intensity to control that. What I want to emphasize here also is that path tracers like Octane have a more easy time to render things if they are less contrasty. So bigger light sources with less contrast and less highlights in the reflections are far more easy to render for Octane than if you have very bright, very strong highlights. And obviously, the more reflections and refractions you have in your scene, the more your render time is affected by that. So if you have a very small, very strong light source, your render time are going to skyrocket, especially if you have additional effects like dispersion and depth of field in your scene. So now you know you can sort of balance this behavior by increasing or decreasing your light sources and increasing or decreasing the strength of them. So having talked about this, let's move on to our actual scene now. Since diamonds are used in a very versatile way, we are going to look at different scenarios for our lighting. And those scenarios are clean product visualization, sparkly diamonds, and something in between, as you've seen last week with the animation I showed. So let's start with the clean visualization work. Alright, welcome to the visualization scene. So this will be the only scene where I tackle the whole lighting setup step by step. With the other scenes, I will just give you an overview so you know how I lit those and can estimate what I did there. So what did I do here? I attached a ring to the diamond so it doesn't feel as lonely. And actually what we are having here is just the diamond, the ring and the diamond material we did in our last tutorial. And what I'm going to go for here is a very classic shot in diamond visualization where we look at the diamond directly on top with our camera. If you Google, for example, diamond engagement ring, you will see a lot of shots like this. So first of all, let's give our scene the essential elements as in a camera and in a plane. The ring has to be laid down on something at least. Let's tackle our camera first by going to the camera, reset the transform, go to the object here and set a focal length of 100mm and then move the camera back so we can see all of the ring. Something like that. So let's go for straight numbers here. 120 should be fine. Alright, so since we want to keep that look intact, so looking down on the diamond directly. Let's move the camera inside of the ring, because the next thing we want to do is move the ring on top of the plane. Let's go to the side view here. So let's move the ring up a little bit and then angle it. So let's see, that's the right angle here. Now, since we want to avoid intersections, it's okay to have a small gap between the ring and the plane here. Also on the back side, so we don't see that anyway, because it's so small. Let's go for round numbers again and actually try if 1.5 is good. Yes, this is good. Okay, let's go back to our 3D view here. And we can see now our ring is moved up on the surface and we are still looking straight at the diamond. Alright, let's tackle the missing materials next by going and set the TUT recording layout and toggle the infos so we don't have to see them. So before we can render, let's actually set up an HDRI so we can see something by going to Objects and then to HDRI Environment and get one of Maxim Rozes HDRIs one more time, and this is the bathroom, which is my absolute favorite. Now let's render and see what we can see here. Alright, so the diamond is the only object that has a material, so we need a material for the ring as well as for the floor. So let's create two materials, one for the ring, which is a metal material, and one for the floor, which is a diffuse glossy material. Here we go. I want to select both of the materials and give both of them a GGX BSDF, since this is more closely representing the reality. With the ring material, the metal material, I want to do a couple of settings here. So first of all, go to Specular and set it to 0.8. Since none of the realistic materials reflects 100% of the energy, there's always happening some absorption. Also, this is a personal preference, but I always like to add some minimal amount of roughness here, at least a little bit, so it's more like in real-world objects. There's not a lot of them that have a very high shine to them. Usually they still inherit at least a little bit of roughness. Let's go over to the floor material and make the surface actually a lot darker. So we go with 0.01 in the brightness, and then we tackle our specular in the index here since it's a dielectric material and get this up to 1.5, and then go to roughness and set this up to 0.25. Those are all personal preference values. You can set most of those to your liking. Let's quickly rename those materials and assign them. Here we go. Let's actually tackle the render settings real quick by going to the max samples here and setting it down to 2048. Depending on your scene, you have to readjust them later, but let's go for a lower number right now. In the specular depth, since we are working with a diamond that has a lot of refractions, we want to actually increase that to at least 32 to get the whole shebang of the diamond that it can deliver. Next of all, as we're dealing with a very small scene, let's actually increase the ray epsilon 1 decimal point here. And last but not least, we want to work with an ACES. So let's go to the camera imager and actually set the ACES tone mapping tick here. Now this makes the scene a lot darker, so to compensate that, let's go up with the exposure 0.5 units to 1.5. Also, the alpha here in the back is a bit disturbing, so let's go back to kernels and disable the alpha for now. Now we have our HDRI showing up in the background, which we also don't want. So what we need to do is duplicate our HDRI here, go into the HDRI, set this to be a RGB spectrum, and then null that out so it becomes black. Now we also light our scene with this black HDRI, hence we see nothing. We want to just have that as a visible background here. Here we go. Now we are golden. Next, we are going to tackle the harsh contrast between the black background and the plane here. So to do that, we are going to go to our node editor and make sure the floor is selected. So what we want to do here is go to our opacity and generate a fall off or a gradient to make the transition here a little bit more easy to the eyes. So let's do this by hitting Tab and generate a gradient generator, which we are going to put into the opacity. But this is linear right now, so the fall off happens from the right side to the left side or vice versa. So what we need to do is go to the radial. Now the radial is also the wrong way around, so we have the opacity at the rim and in the middle there's nothing. Let's go outside of our camera to show you that a little bit better. Here we go. So what we want to do is invert that. By inverting that, we are getting the right behavior. But what we also can see is that we are getting some repetitions. So let's actually get rid of those repetitions by going for the repetition mode and setting it to the white color. Normally it's the black color, but since we inverted it, it's the white color. Here we go. So last but not least, we want to avoid the gamma 2.2 and actually set this to a gamma 1. And then the last thing we are going to do is getting in a Octane gradient to actually shape our transparency a little bit more. So right now, let me just go into the diffuse and make this lighter so we can see this a little bit better. So right now the fall off starts at the exact middle and then falls off to the rim. What we want to do is create a little bit of an island here where there's no transparency. So to do that, we're going to take the white color knot here and move that in just a little bit. So for example, to 80% from 100. And this makes the fall off start slightly outside of the ring. Alright, so here we go. Let's go back to our dark color here, 0.01, and then go back to the camera and let's see what we've done. And yes, this is a nice fall off towards the background. So now that we've done all that, let's actually begin to tackle the lighting. You could say this is a finished render, but there's still a couple of things that I'm not satisfied with. One thing is that you can actually see the room in the background, which is not very professional. And the other thing is that our diamond here is missing something, for example, some contrast. So let's tackle both of those things by going into the HDRI and actually bringing up the nodes for it. So right now we are just using one image to use as our HDRI, and we can rotate it around and see what looks best. But what I actually want to do is get some magic going in here in the node tree. And if you don't know, the node tree for our environment is actually the same one as for our materials. So you have access to all of the nodes that are there for our materials as well. So what I want to do is, first of all, I want to exchange this HDRI for a blurred out version of it. So I have blurred out the HDRI in Photoshop to generate something like this. So essentially this is giving us a very smooth appearance, but it also gets rid of all the edges and the nice contrast in the HDRI. So what I want to do is actually mix two HDRIs together. So let's actually duplicate that one here and go for another one. So let's go back here and actually choose this one here. Now if I put that in solely here, you can see this gives us a very harsh contrast without lighting huge portions of the ring, for example. So we will mix that to have the best of both worlds. And to mix HDRIs, you can use a mix node, but also you can add a add node, because those effects are additive. So let's bring in an add node and add both of our HDRIs together. Here we go. And let's disable the preview because we don't need it. Now there's a couple of things you just saw, and one of those things is that the scene got immediately a lot brighter. So with additive modes, of course, you're adding the one HDRI on top of the other and things get brighter. So let's make them darker again. And I already know the values because I used them before. So our environment, our room needs to be a power of 0.25 and the other HDRI needs to be a power of 0.5. Here we go. So if you are doing this the first time, you will notice that if we try to rotate our HDRIs, this is not working any longer. And this is because it only works when one HDRI is directly connected to the texture slot in our environment. To sort of fix that, we need to get an UV transform to both of our HDRIs here. Here we go. And what the UV transform here is doing, giving us a lot of transform options. But we will just need the transform here, because the transform X is actually the rotation X mentioned here. So I already again know my values here, but if you just rotate this HDRI, you can see that something is moving, and this is actually the same as what we have gotten with our movement in our HDRI before. So what we're going to do is set this to minus 0.25. And we go here and set this to 0.375 and minus 0.2. Here we go. So now that we've done that, you can see that we're really missing some contrast in our diamond because all the bright parts here is reflecting off of our diamonds. Now this is something that needs to be done in a 3D scene, but doesn't need to be done in a production scene, since the production scene has an obstacle that is very useful. What do I mean by that? If you remember the first part of our tutorial series where we measured the diamond's accuracy by having some measuring device, you might remember that there was some pattern forming on the diamond which was telling us that we had an excellent cut. So we sort of want to bring back that pattern in here, but despite being colorful, just the contrast of it. So what we need to do is actually very simple. We need to get a disk here. And the disk, we will need to bring that into the camera as a child and then again go to the coordinates and reset the transform. Next, we want to go to the object and set it to -C here and move it a little bit more to the back so it's not intersecting with our lens. And then last but not least, create a completely black material. So we go to our materials, create a diffuse material, which we then call absorber, and make completely black. Here we go. And then we go ahead and attach that material to the disk and look through our camera again. Now this is very dark and this is because the disk is very large, but if we make the disk smaller, you can see now there is a pattern forming here in the diamond which gives us a great contrast. And basically this is happening in the real world on its own because the camera is in front of the diamond and takes away light, and therefore you get this contrast on its own. But since the 3D camera is consistent of nothing and is not reflecting anywhere, we need to do that by inserting a black disk here, and therefore creating those nice patterns that gives our diamond a lot of contrast and this nice iconic look. We are not finished yet. There's actually two more things I need to tackle here. One thing is the colored background. As we are emulating studio photography, those come with monochromatic light sources, so there's no color in them. So actually mimic that by going into the HDRI and into the nodes again, then selecting our image and choose from normal to float to make it black and white. And we can even do that for our other HDRI image to save some VRAM. The second thing I want to do is tackle the depth of field here. So our scene is very small, so in the real world there would be some depth of field. To do this, let's go to our camera, right click and go to extensions and actually choose the Octane camera tag. So since we are dealing with such a small scene, having the f-stop to, for example, 2.5 gives us an incredible amount of depth of field, and actually it's a bit too much, so our diamond starts to look washed out. So let's increase the f-stop to decrease the blurring amount, and I found 10 to be a good amount here. Another thing that bugs me here is the autofocus, since it focuses on the front plane of the diamond, and we want to focus a slight bit behind the front plane to get the nice contrast again. So let's do this by go to the camera, object, and picking our focus here and actually increase that focus distance a little bit more to, if I can do that, to 117. And now our fragments in here are nice and sharp, while the background ring is slightly out of focus, exactly what we want. There will be a future tutorial where I tackle the universal camera with all its bokeh features and its goodness, as this would be way past our time frame for this video, also tackling in that in here. Do you remember a very long time ago at the beginning of this video I was telling you something about sparkliness of diamonds and lights? While this scene in particular doesn't need a lot of sparkliness, I want to set up some lights to increase the sparkliness anyway. So let's go and create a null object here and create a light source by going to Objects, Lights and Area Light. Now let's go outside of the camera here and view the scene. So there's two things with the light. It is sticking in the middle of the scene and it's rather huge. So let's fix those by moving the light source back maybe 300 units and making it a little bit smaller by going with 100 by 100 units. Here we go. Now, as I said, the sparkiness of the diamond is really dependent on the light size and the light strength. You can mix and match that to your liking. I'm sticking with 100 by 100 for now. So what I want to do is put that as a child object into the null. Let's call the null light A. So what we did by that is we created an axis point to rotate the light around the diamond. So let's do this by rotating the light minus 35 degrees to the left and maybe even move it up a little bit, maybe so minus 20. So it looks over the edge of our world. Now I don't want to do that with one light only, I want to actually create 3 lights. So let's do this by duplicating those lights and call them B and C. So let's move the B light to the middle and make it look even a little bit higher from above, so we get to avoid the disk we just created to obscure our camera. And let's actually be a little bit lazy and just move the C light to the other side here. Alright. So if we go back to our camera and render, we can see our scene is now very bright and the diamond has not gotten very sparkly. This is basically because the lights are a little bit too bright. So what I want to do here is actually to split out those lights into their different paths. So in compositing, we can decide how much of every light we see and how much sparkliness we want in our scene. And this is a very good thing because it's after the fact of rendering, so we can mix and match them very closely to our intent. So let's set up our light AOVs. To do that, we need to go into the Octane render settings. So since we're already there, let's tackle all the render settings at once. But first of all, we want to bring those lights into different groups. So for that, we need to go into their tags here and actually set the light passes to 2 and light pass 3. There's another way you can do that, so let's go back to light pass 1 for all of those. And this is the light manager here. So what you can do here is by dragging and dropping, you can actually give their lights their own ID. And if we look this up, then yes, it worked. So we have set up those lights. Just another way to do things. So let's go actually to our render settings here and engage Octane as our renderer. Now in the main tab of Octane, let's actually change the color space. Since we are already engaged in a ASYS-CG workflow, we want to stay in that workflow till our comp stage so we don't break up anything in between. Okay, let's go to our render AOV group, enable that. I've made a tutorial about this, so if you want to engage in more in-depth information, you can click that link above here. First of all, let's paste in our render token path. Then we want to go to the DWAB compression, save our beauty, and turn off multi-layer files. And then actually go into our render AOV manager here. Let's search for light and actually create 4 light passes here. Why 4? That's really easy to explain because we have an ambient light, our HDRIs, and then 3 other light sources. Here we go, 1, 2, and 3. So for good measure, we also could use a cryptomat. So let's actually add a cryptomat with material node name. So we get a cryptomat for every assigned material in our scene. Here we go. Let's close that all down and let's see if everything worked out as intended. We have our environment, our HDRI, light 1, light 2, and light 3, and our cryptomat. Nice. So seeing those lights, we need to tackle those and make minor changes to them. First of all, they might be still a little bit too bright, so let's get them a little bit darker by setting the power to its half, so from 100 to 50. And then I find those light sources a little bit big still, so let's make them all a little bit smaller by also halving the size from 100 to 50. Now you can see that we get some sparkliness for every one of those lights. To render this out, we need to increase our samples actually, so those lights are not as noisy as this. So let's go back to our settings here and actually increase the lights to maybe 8K. And we can make a render region here and let's see if 8K so roughly is enough. Since we are planning to use some denoising on the scene, that should be fine. So let's go back to our main scene here. Let's see how this is looking with our extra lights. It's not too different than just the HDRI on its own. So we are ready with the scene. We can now render it out and open it in Comp. Okay, hold on. So before we go to Comp, let's actually talk about the other scenes. And I know that this scene in particular was of interest to you. Let's have a look at the lighting of this scene. I know that materials of course would be of interest also, but tackling the materials would be a universe in itself and very complex, so I will probably make tutorials in the future about materials, but we will leave that out for now. The most important thing is that you already know how to do the diamond material, and since the diamonds are the most prominent object here in the scene, we are good to go. Alright, let's have a look at this scene here. So first things first, I go to the camera imager and show you that I also use the ACES tone mapping here. So if I turn that off, you can see the scene gets a lot less contrasty here. But the highlights are blown out and this is not what I want. So ACES is really beneficial when working with strong highlights as with the diamonds here. So how did I go about the lighting in the scene? So let's move outside of the camera and place it somewhere we can see everything of it. Here we go. So basically it's rather simple and maybe a bit disappointing, so I always light for the camera, so the scene around that always falls apart quite quickly. Let's go through the different light sources and see what they're doing. So we have an HDRI here, and as the keen-eyed among you might have guessed, this is the HDRI from Maxim Ross, shout out to him again, with the bathroom scene. So we have that, and we also split that out into passes or AOVs, so we can show you. So I just altered the position slightly to match my vision here. Then we have the light that's coming through the gaps of the polygons I placed here to create this spotlight effect, where when we go back into the camera, we can see that the parts of the image where I want the viewer to look at are emphasized. And this is mainly the main diamond and the magnifying glass here. Right, let's go outside of the camera once more. So we have another light, and what might that be? So let's go to the other light here and maybe make it visible. Here we go. Let's zoom out further. So it's a light source that's rather far away and rather small. And if I go back to my camera, you can see it's basically a sparkly light. So this is an extra light source to make the diamonds more sparkly. It might be a bit strong, so you have very harsh contrasts here. But in the comp stage later, we can exactly decide how much of the influence of this light we want to see, so we can make it weaker if we want to. And then also we have our cryptomatte pass as we had before in our scene with the ring. Okay, let's go back to main. And obviously this one here needs a lot of samples, especially since I also use the universal camera with its special bokeh and stuff. So as I said, I will make a tutorial about the universal camera later on. For now, the only thing that matters is that you can get more fancy or realistic bokeh using the universal camera. As I pointed out before, the bokeh here with small light sources needs a lot of sampling. So small light sources and bokehs are sort of enemies. They don't play well with each other. So what we need to do here is go brute force and get the sample count to a very, very high level. In my case, I went with 32,000. And this of course takes a while to render. And this is also the reason why you would need a good render farm or a good setup at home to be able to render animations like I did. To avoid rendering parts of the image that are already clean to 32,000 pixels, we engage the adaptive sampling so they are spared when they are clean enough. You might be surprised, but even this massive amount of samples isn't enough to clean up all the bokeh back there. So I have another secret, and this is denoising. So in compositing, I denoise the parts of the image that are not clean selectively to get a very clean render out of it. And if I play the actual animation right now, you can see there's no perceptible noise in there, so it does a very clean job when you do it right. Again, render settings are almost the same as with the other scene, so let's have a look at the third scene now. Alright, so this might be very familiar to you if you're coming from the other scenes. So we have an HDRI again and a couple of light sources. So there's a small difference with the HDRI in that I'm using another HDRI and I actually use only a small slice of it. So I am duplicating that small slice in a circle around the scene and then moving it, because that basically gave me better visuals for my logo. I'm using that same HDRI for the intro logos, so the Silverwing and Octane ones that you see with the anisotropy on it. But essentially you can use anything you like that looks good on your scene. And with the lights, again, let's go into the lights. I have made a light for the metal reflection. So this light is moving around the object. So let's go outside of the camera and show you. Again, we need to turn on the lights to see them. Here we go. So I have two light sources that are rotating around and make nice reflections on the metal. And then you already have spotted the other light source. Again, a small one further away. And this, as you might have guessed, is our sparkly light. So let's go to this light source here. This is also visible on the anisotropy of the metal, but mostly this is also doing the sparkliness of the diamonds. So if I move that, the diamonds begin to sparkle because that light source is so bright and so small. So if you want to have the diamonds looking a lot more sparkly, you actually go for smaller, brighter light sources. And if one is not enough, if the diamonds are not sparkly enough, then do multiple light sources. And of course, know that adding more small light sources is increasing your render time. And basically that's it. So we finally can jump into the compositing stage here. Oh no, what is this? It doesn't look like compositing. So one more thing before we actually jump into compositing. And this is energy and light preservation, I guess. So I made light sources here with different intensities. So we go from 0.1 to 1 to 10 to 50 to 100. And you can see that the brightness is changing, of course, in the intensity of the light sources. So why do I show this to you? Basically to further the understanding between intensities and ACEs and light sources and compositing. So for example, if we go here into the camera manager and change the exposure, you can see that formerly overexposed light sources can be made exposed correctly, so they are not overexposed again. And the brighter the light source, the further down I have to get my exposure to match the exposure of the light source. Now with ACEs, we have the ACEs sRGB tone mapping, and you can see, especially in the reflection of the brightest light here, that it looks much better than the blown out highlight it produces without the ACEs tone mapping. And where this connects all together is the 32-bit EXR or floating point EXR export from your 3D app to your compositing. You can do it in the way that the light is baked in, so to speak. We can see what we are getting in our rendered image with the ACEs, but then even the brightest light will be clamped down to 1, so we only get images from black to white. But if we actually opt for a linear workflow, where we have a floating point image as the exchange, we keep all the intensity in here. So we can do exactly the same thing in compositing as here by changing the exposure and get back overexposed highlights. Also, we can do exactly the same thing with the ACEs tone mapping because it has access to all of the data it needs to tone map the image down. Why I am telling you this is because with diamonds we want to have sparkliness, and sparkliness comes from really bright pixels such as this here from our diamonds. And therefore, if we go to, for example, post, turn on glow here, you can see that the brighter the light source, of course, the more it glows. And the dimmer the light source, we don't get as much glow. And here in Octane, this works as well because the glow has access to all the brightness data. So imagine the whole image was clamped down to a brightness of white. So if we turn off the glow, this light source would look the same than those two do the glow, and there would be no way for the glow to know that this light source is 10 times lower intensity than this times, because both of them look white. And this is the exact principle and reason why I do the EXR workflow, because you get all the data that is generated from the rendering over to compositing and can do stuff that you former would have done in the rendering stage. This is not only important for glow, but for all the scene integrity. So if you comp light sources together, for example, or have the sparkly intensity of the diamonds. So let's finally go over to comp now. Alright, finally welcome to our comp part. Let's bring home the intensity stuff here so you definitely understand what I'm about to tell you with the intensity and what the real huge benefit is when you're dealing with EXR workflows. Since I couldn't decide on one comp program to do this whole thing, we are doing it both in AfterEffects and Fusion. So first of all, in Fusion, I brought in my render as an sRGB render. So let's assign the sRGB profile here to get the right lightness back. If you don't have the sRGB option here, this comes as part of the Reactor plugin. If you're new to Fusion and don't know your way around it, I made a tutorial about that. You can watch it here. So let's concentrate on what I wanted to show you here. So you can see those numbers down here that represent the lightness values in the scene. So if I go over with my mouse to this slide where we set up a 0.1 value, you can see this roughly matches here the 0.1 value. Then we have a 1 value, 10 value, 50 value, and a 100 value. And this is the big thing. We have the same values that we set up in our 3D scene now in our compositing stage. so we can do things in a similar manner as we did in the 3D stage, for example, changing the exposure. Now let's go over to After Effects and experience the same. So in After Effects, what's really important is to set your scene to 32 bits. I also made a tutorial if you're working with ACEs. This is a little bit different. You can set it up here. Okay, but setting it up as 32 bits sRGB linear working space, this is important to get the right values out of that. And if I hover over with the mouse, this time you have to look here, you can see it's also the same values, 0.1, 1, 10, 50 and 100. And if I change the exposure now, you can see that formerly overexposed parts now come in and roll back into exposed parts, so they're no longer overexposed. And this is the really huge benefit of a floating point workflow, where you have data coming from the render without any loss of data going over to the compositing stage. So why am I hitting that point home so hard? It's basically the same with diamonds. Those diamonds have very, very bright highlights in a colorful way. And to make them sparkle, we need a process to contain those highlights throughout our workflow. And as I said, the linear workflow with 16-bit or 32-bit float EXRs is probably the best way to do that. So let's finally carry on with our diamonds. Alright, let's actually do this in the same succession as we did that in 3D. So here's our ring we rendered first. And let's see what we can do to that. So we are engaged in an ACEs workflow. Again, if you don't know how to set this up, I made a tutorial about this. So let's follow this tutorial. It's linked in the description below. So let's set this small comp up from scratch here. And we have our 3 lighting layers. So we have our, or 4 lighting layers, I should say. So we have our main layer from the HDRI. Then we have our light 1 that's sparkly, light 2 that's sparkly, and light 3 that's sparkly. Here we go. So to make them all show up at once, we need to add all of those light layers on top. So the workflow is to add them, and then we get the same image back that we had in our 3D program. Now this is much too bright and doesn't look that good. So what I did was actually I decided that the lighting layer for the sparkly light 2 is too much, so I excluded it. Let's go back to the main comp. Here we go, you can see that added too much brightness. And for the sparkling layer 1 and 3, I actually did go down with the intensity quite a lot. So instead of 100% opacity, we ended up with a 2% opacity. And since we are dealing with very high values here, even a 2% opacity gives us some values to play with. Now, in the end, I ended up doing a little bit of an adjustment here. So making the scene a little bit more contrasty. So here we go, let's go through them one more time. So first of all, I added an optical glow. Now, this is a bit of a crux here. So if you are just using After Effects tools, there's no good way to glow things because you sort of need a glow that fades off exponentially to represent the glow, for example, that also Octane is producing, and basically every glow that naturally exists within lenses or sensors of cameras. So if you don't have the exponential glow, I don't know how you would get something that looks quite as nice as this. Maybe you can go with the After Effects glow, but it's very limited in my opinion. So next I just added some curves to it, so just darkening the darker tones here to give the scene more contrast. And last but not least, it's a bit big here right now, so let's make this a little bit smaller again. Here we go. So I boosted the blue tones to make the image a little bit more on the colder side, because I sometimes like that. And this gives us our ring image. Now I did even more to that, as I did some chromatic aberration and then some final adjustments. We need to go to none to see what it's looking like to make that even more prettier. But we are not in the comp workflow tutorial that will follow, by the way, where I go over my comp workflow in Aces in AfterEffects, so keep your eyes out for that. But right now we are just dealing with how to add sparkles to the diamond. Hopefully you forgive me for rushing over this, but this tutorial has been already really long, and I know that attention spans of people are getting shorter and shorter. Now we have like to play 2 videos at the same time on your stories to keep people engaged, so I really thank you for watching this that long. Welcome to Fusion Land. I will be skipping over a lot of things here, so again, if you want to learn that, you can watch the tutorial linked down in the description. So here I have my scene inside of Fusion, and we are doing the same thing more or less as in After Effects by going through the different paths and adding them together. Now you can see with the sparkly paths here, when we look at the highlights here, those have still quite a bit of noise, and this is where the Neat Video denoiser comes in. So if I go here, you can see I underneath that have the Neat Video noise reduction, and if I apply that, you can see it's doing a splendid job in keeping the details while doing the noise reduction. Now, when I go back to my scale to fit, what you can also see is that I used a mask here. And this mask is there to prevent the denoising happening at the sharp areas, because those sharp areas usually don't have that much noise, and the noise is most prevalent in the most blurred areas here with the highlights. So I wanted to maintain the sharpness, even though the Neat Video plugin is doing a very good job in retaining the sharpness and detail. I don't want it to take any chances, so I mask the sharp portions out with a mask here. So again, this is our render as it comes in, and we are doing all sorts of goodness treating, as putting in a vignette and also going with a chromatic aberration here. Obviously, every render needs a bit of chromatic aberration, so you don't have to overdo it, because then it's looking too strong. But if you do it a little bit, it really benefits the realism of the look. So again, also what I skipped before was that I boosted the bright yellow light here a little bit. So if I toggle this on and off, you can see that it was a bit too weak for me. So I lifted the gain just a little bit on that. Alright, so last but not least, a little bit of color correction, a little bit of film grain, and then the conversion from the OpenColor AO to sRGB, and then we end up with the final result. And so, as you might have noticed, I didn't explain the glow here. It's actually the same thing as in After Effects, it's just a different plugin. It's the exponential glow here. And it acts the same as the After Effects plugin. So if I turn it on and off, you can see that the highlights here are beginning to glow, and this gives us the really nice treatment, and it starts to look rather nice. Simon Fiedler lately told me that there is an X-Glow plugin that also comes with Reactor that does really nice things and has even more extended function than the exponential glow. So maybe I will have a look at this later on. But overall, it's very easy to understand. We add our passes together. We do some goodness treatments. So for example, the glows, do some chromatic aberration, and then go for the transform from the Aces to sRGB. And this leaves us with a very nice looking image. Alright, on to the last scene in After Effects again. So this is the last thing I will show because this gets really repetitive. So first of all, this is an ACES project. So again, the link to the tutorial is down in the description if you want to see how to set this up. Next, as with the rings, we have our lights separated into different passes so we can turn them on and off. Let's do so. Here we go. So we have our HDRI. Then we have our light that is creating the nice reflections on the metallic parts. And then we have our sparkly light. So as you can see, the sparkly light is really sparkly. And this is basically coming together with the optical glow here. So if I turn off the optical glow, you can see how much of a big difference this makes. And the optical glow basically only works because we have those massive intensities in our diamonds due to the sparkly light. So if I go to my info once more and sample some of those sparkliness highlights here, we have values from 19 to 28 here. Again, 38 here. I think that's the brightest it will go. So we are at the value of 45 now. So if we put the glow on that, you can see that those highlights will glow and sparkle accordingly. And this is essentially what I was talking about the whole time. So if we zoom out again, it's basically the same with the rings. So we have a glow to get our highlights going, then we have a curves to give the image a little bit more contrast, and last but not least we have a color curves to make it a little bit in the direction that I want the colors to be in. So in this case, a little bit more reddish, a little bit more warm. And this is essentially it. So if you are working within a linear workflow, whether it is sRGB or ACES, you can bring out those sparkles very nicely in comp and therefore also get the intensity dialed in right. So if you want the sparkliness to be more sparkly or the glows to be bigger, of course you can just set the glows higher and then the realistic stuff happens. And this is the really nice thing with bringing over realistic intensities from your 3D scene to your comp stage and doing the goodness treatment as in glows and color correction there. And basically this is why I am such a huge fan of this workflow. The downside, of course, being that it is rather complicated to understand if you're doing it the first time, and you can do a lot of mistake that later on leads to images that don't look that good. But if you're having it done a couple of times, I swear to you, it's the best thing to do because you have so much flexibility and I can't recommend it enough. Alright, you're done. Thank you very much for sticking with me all the time. That was quite something, wasn't it? Sorry for skipping ahead that fast in the last part, but I didn't want to stretch this tutorial any longer than it has to be. So thanks again for staying with me. Thank you very much for your support. I'll make this really short, hopefully until next week, and happy sparkling. Bye.